Krishna Memani, Vice Chairman with Invesco. Mr. Memani, good morning. Thank you for joining us. How do you see Indian markets right now, given where the slowdown concerns are, both domestically and globally?
So the Indian markets are suffering from the same thing that emerging markets are suffering overall. The growth outlook on a global basis is not very rosy, and the valuations in Indian markets were high to begin with, and there was a bit of a euphoria following the election, and they're giving up, or they're giving back on that rise after the elections. So the growth outlook in India has deteriorated, and there was nothing in the budget that kind of helps it. So this is something that we'll be dealing with for quite some time.
Has the government taken adequate steps to address the liquidity concerns in your view?
No, not at all. I think if you look at risks in the Indian economy and therefore for the Indian markets in the near term, the NBFC cash squeeze is by far the biggest near-term concern. And a recapitalization plan and other things at the margin really doesn't solve the issue in any meaningful way. If the government is really concerned about near-term growth, they have to take far more concrete actions than what they have done so far. The Indian market liquidity conditions in the Indian economy is not good, and it is not improving. As a matter of fact, it's probably deteriorating, and that is something that they have to be very concerned about.
Okay, so, let's take a look at the, entire issue with regards to the tax on FPIs as well. Just your view on that, Krishna. It's obviously going to dent sentiment quite significantly.
Well, so I think the challenge the government faces in the budget is on the revenue side. The growth outlook is not good enough to generate significant amount of revenue growth, and so they have to find ways of replenishing that. The Reserve Bank dividend helps somewhat. PSU sales help somewhat, but at the end of the day, the growth outlook has to improve, and that's not improving. So they are running around trying to find revenues from whatever sources that they possibly can. I think while they are focused on the revenue side, their real challenge is on the expenditure side. Transfer payments for certain parts of the economy, I think, are good political objectives, but from a long-term perspective, that they really don't do much for getting growth going in the Indian economy. So it's a big challenge, and taxation and other revenue measures are really not helping much on that front.
Sure. How prolonged, in your view, can this slowdown be? I mean, even consumption heavyweights, names like Titan, Bajaj Finance, GCPL, they're all acknowledging the slowdown quite openly now. What are your thoughts on the current trend that we're seeing?
Well, so that is something that the government has to be very, very concerned about. That is, because of their policy measures in the last administration, they basically squeezed the Indian economy real hard. Coming out of the elections, they have to take real measures, and they have to take real measures soon. Otherwise, the growth outlook for the Indian economy is not going to be 7%. It is going to go below 6% very rapidly. We need some economic remedy, and they haven't provided any of that in the current budget, and I don't see any discussions on that front. This is a really critical issue for the Indian economy, and they have to get to it really quickly. Otherwise, growth is going to be much lower than what we are anticipating and what they are anticipating in their budget numbers.
Wanted to also get your thoughts on the FII flows into India. With the current valuations and the corporate setup, how do you see that panning out?
Well, so I think flows in India will come about if the growth outlook for India improves meaningfully. And that's what we were hoping for. We were hoping for some real concrete policy action relatively quickly. They have to do that in the first 2 years of the current administration, because otherwise they'll be into politics in the second half, and the likelihood of coming up with concrete actions in that phase is very difficult. So they have to come up with some real concrete policy action, and there doesn't seem to be much going on that front. So given the valuation level and growth outlook deteriorating rather than improving, both on a short-term and long-term basis, it's very difficult for me to see significant amount of new flows coming into the Indian markets from foreign investors.
Fair enough. Let's nail it down to individual sectors then. Auto has been seeing a lot of pain. We've seen a sharp valuation cut. Do you think it merits a closer look?
Well, so autos is a global industry, and I think the valuation cuts in autos is in line with valuation cuts everywhere else. This is not a sector that I think I think is going to be a favored sector by anybody, and again, not just in India, on a global basis. The capital expenditure requirements as they transition from fossil fuel technology to electric technology and autonomous vehicles, the capital expenditures are gargantuan. And in that sort of, and the payoff is very, very spotty or very uncertain. So in that environment, I don't think autos is really where I want to put my money in.
So what are your thoughts on the broader market valuations then?
Well, so I think the opportunity in the Indian market for foreign investors is really in mid-cap, small-cap, micro-cap. And the reason for that is most of the flows that have arrived in India from foreign investors really have come from investors who are kind of making an emerging market-wide allocation rather than an India allocation. And therefore, those investors focus on names that they know, the large-cap names and, the consumer story and things like that. And that's why the valuations on those sectors is relatively rich, actually quite rich relative to the rest of the emerging market. So if you're going to invest in Indian equities, my preference would be small cap rather than large cap.
Okay. Now, Powell's latest commentary suggests that the Fed is readying for that rate cut in July. Are you expecting the same? Is this in line with expectations? And how does the setup then look like for emerging markets like India over the medium term?
So yes, we expect the Fed to cut rates in July. Powell had an opportunity to walk that market expectation back in his testimony in Congress, and he didn't. So I think it is almost certain that July they will cut. We expect another cut in September, and the reason for that is very simple. Inflation is relatively absent, and in that environment, there is really no reason for the Federal Reserve to try to squeeze the U.S. economy down. And we expect monetary policy to be far easier on a global basis, including India for that matter, than it had been in 2017, 2018. That certainly helps emerging markets because it basically takes the luster off of the dollar, and therefore dollar probably softens some. In that environment, emerging market equities have done well, and you'll probably see revival of those flows back into emerging markets. And India would be an indirect beneficiary of those flows.
Now, you also mentioned that the entire liquidity situation has rather deteriorated, that the government needs to take concrete steps. So what are these steps that you would like to see in order to improve the entire liquidity situation?
They have to take a real direct leadership position with respect to injecting liquidity in the market. And the best example of that I can cite is what the Federal Reserve did in 2008. The U.S. market at that time was getting squeezed every which way, and they found really creative ways of providing liquidity in the marketplace. Clearly, all of that entailed a significant amount of risk, and whatever the government does today in India will probably entail a significant amount of risk as well. But they have no choice. If they don't do that, if they just simply rely on recapitalization of the banks and that leading to a significant improvement in liquidity conditions, It doesn't seem to me that that is likely to happen. So they have to, I can't specifically indicate a measure that they have to take, but they have to take direct action rather than relying on recapitalization or the banking channel to make it all work. I mean, the Reserve Bank of India, if it looks hard enough, can find tools and mechanisms to help with that. It's really a question of political will rather than finding ways of injecting liquidity in the market.
All right. Thank you so much for taking time out. It's been a pleasure having you on ET Now, talking about an array of topics from the liquidity situation to individual sectors and even commentary from the Fed chair.